us live, I believe, or at least one, Gwen Hackle. We're glad that you're here. So we're going to talk about transformative learning, and probably the first time, or the first thing that I should talk about is why are we talking about this? For one, I want it, well, if you want to access this presentation, I had that up there earlier, but for me, I wanted to know more about this. I keep hearing at SNU that we do transformative learning experiences for our students, but I haven't really had a good handle on what that actually means, what it looks like. And after doing some research and after interviewing Dennis, I have a much better handle on it, but this is certainly not any sort of exhaustive study. This is not the be-all, end-all gospel truth with a T sort of thing. It's just a conversation that I hope that we can continue. I don't think that I'm adding anything to the conversation other than I'm not doing any sort of groundbreaking research is what I mean. So I'm hoping that I'm adding to the conversation here on our campus. So my notes, for some reason, like the second slide, I'm already off with my notes. So if you guys will just bear with me.
So your notes have transformed.
Yeah, my notes have transformed into something other than what I thought they were.
It's not.
Exactly.
I'm feeling confident.
I'm really glad that she's here.
I'll limit my comments.
I've heard the term transformative learning thrown around this place for quite a while, and I really wanted to get a better idea of what that was. And I've had the opportunity recently to discuss some of my experiences here in a different setting, and I can point to some specific places, specific events that I can see how my beliefs were challenged, my behavior was changed. My undergraduate experience here was a transformative experience. I just haven't really been able to figure out why and how that occurred. But so anyway, that's kind of one of the reasons that we're talking about this. I'll just mention a couple of the bigger names in the research for transformative learning. The one that I kept seeing come up is Jack Mazzero. You really can't read anything on transformative learning without reading Jack Mazzero's name. And then also in secondary and elementary school, Alan November and Daniel Pink are two that I continue to see pop up as well on my research. So the first thing I want us to do is just look at these images for just a minute. That's several different images, and how do you just think about how those images could be connected? It's a good time for that. So what we'll do at the end is we'll revisit those images and see if there is a connection between those things and or if there's some different connection now. Some of you probably recognize a few of those things. Maybe you don't all recognize all of them, but we'll see at the end. We'll see if we can transform our outlook on these images by the end of this. So why are we talking about this? Again, I pulled this right off the website. Central to the mission of the university, students will engage in transformational learning experiences designed to explore what it means to seek truth together within a Christ-centered community of scholars. So that's right there on our website. It's not necessarily, that's not our mission statement, but it's a piece that we believe strongly enough to put it on our website and advertise it to our prospective clients and our current clients as well. Although our mission statement does have the word transforming in it, so I think this is also tied up with that. I definitely want to, probably from my days in public school, I need to write the objectives on the board. So hopefully we can get through these three things by the end of our time together. is to be able to define transformative learning, relate it to our own practice, and figure out where we fit in the mission of transformative learning here at SNU. If it's part of our mission, then I think we all need to see, or at least think about where we fit. And I'm still figuring that out. So hopefully we can move in that direction. Dr. Hackler, if you're out there, I know that you're out there. If you have questions, feel free to chime in. So we're glad that you're here. I already mentioned that. Okay. So part of my research on this topic was to interview Dennis, and he said, these are his words, quote, "Before a student enters your classroom, he or she exists in some state of being. And after leaving your class at the end of the semester, he or she should exist in some different state of being." And so I would say, that's the end quote, I would say that if this isn't the case, we need to reevaluate what we're doing in our classes. And that change in state should go beyond simply learning a bunch of facts about something. So what is transformational learning? It's a particular lens, a learning lens, and those are my words, I didn't see that in the research. A change in the view of self, maybe how we perceive ourselves, a change in our views or beliefs, and or a change in behavior. It could be any number of these things. And so that picture on the right side, probably the science part of me had to have a science diagram. And we're all reasonably familiar, probably did something with it in elementary school, where you have the caterpillar, well, you have the egg, then the caterpillar, which goes into a cocoon or a chrysalis in this stage, or in this case, and then emerges as an adult, and you have the adult butterfly. So, I mean, think about this organism in the stage of the caterpillar and what its perspective is. What do you think the perspective of the caterpillar is? How does the caterpillar view the world?
Edible.
Okay, edible, absolutely. It's walking around on leaves all the time, and it wants to eat the leaves, absolutely.
Pretty limited perspective, I would think.
One of the things that kept coming up with me and is a science show that I watched one time, and they were talking about different dimensions and how our perspective changes. And they talked about an ant walking on a wire and how its view of the world is like one-dimensional. You know, it's just going around that wire, down that wire, whatever. But then if you think in more dimensions, you've got the up, the forward and back, and the side to side. So you've got 3 dimensions, you've got different perspectives. What about the chrysalis? What might its perspective be? It seems like it's like worse than the caterpillar, actually. I mean, if we're going to evaluate these for good, better, best, I would say that the chrysalis is probably the least of these that I'd want to be. So,
But you could look at the chrysalis as all introspective.
Okay, so,
It's closed off from everything else.
okay.
It can only think about itself.
Oh, that's good.
How about the butterfly? What might its perspective be, and how might it be different from the other two?
I think we actually skipped a step within chrysalis and
The
adult.
Yeah, the
emerging.
adult.
The emerging sounds very vulnerable.
Painful even.
Could be, yes.
Okay.
Where it's probably, I mean, its wings aren't fully dry yet. It's kind of hanging out. It doesn't have nearly as much mobility. I would sort of, if I could, I really hate metaphors, but I'll play with it for that.
Oh, this is going to be full of metaphors.
Yeah, no,
today.
we're good. We're good. It's personal.
Okay.
That would be like in between, I know I should do something and actual action. So sort of like the cognitive dissonance, oh no, shoot.
Okay, I'll just say right now up front that Katie did not see my slides, but I do have the word cognitive dissonance on another slide.
My achievers.
And that's actually a great point. The 2 perspectives that you guys have on this particular thing shows how we benefit from hearing other people's perspectives, because I didn't think about the introspective and I didn't think about the vulnerable perspective either in those stages. So those are great. I appreciate you guys sharing those. So to the adult, it's no longer the caterpillar, in the edible world. It's no longer the introspective. It's no longer the very vulnerable, emergent adult. I can see where my kids might fit into these stages as they make decisions, maybe not the best decisions in the world, but I have to let them be vulnerable and learn from that. So how might the adult's perspective be different? Not to belabor the point too long.
I think it would be broader than the caterpillars. It's
Absolutely.
definitely gonna be looking down at things rather than.
It's funny because this, I just saw something about the monarch butterflies on the news day before yesterday. And so maybe that's why I chose this, I don't know. But it was talking about them coming from like Maryland and getting to Mexico. They don't take the most direct route. They actually fly over land. And so they come, through Oklahoma, through Texas, through Louisiana, Arkansas, that way. The caterpillar doesn't even know that Arkansas exists, but as it goes on as an adult, then it's experiencing all these new things. It's very different behavior. Its beliefs are very different than it was when it was in a different stage.
Much more remote.
Absolutely. Say again.
He now says, I believe I can fly.
That's exactly right. I mean,
I
it's
believe I can fly.
very much more mobile, much easier to transit somewhere else. Absolutely.
More maneuverable and empowered as well.
We have a couple of comments.
Okay.
Tamara, hi Tamara,
Hey, Tamara.
says the adult has experience to share with others that can scaffold learning.
Okay, let me pause right there because Tamara has not seen our slides either. But scaffolding is already on there, so maybe I'm getting the idea that we're preaching to the choir here. I don't know. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, and then Dr. Hackler says, and the adult has probably already experienced an identifiable transformative shift already.
That's absolutely true. That's one of the things that was strange for me was being able to look at my undergraduate education as transformative because I was an adult. I was a 35-year-old, I was already had the receding hairline and, the whole bit. And so I thought like I had experienced my transformative stuff, but school was a big deal. And I'll just throw the praise all on SNU and say our faculty's second to none. So. Okay, one thing I do want to mention is there is a caveat to this. You're not responsible for all of those stages with your student. You might be just responsible for the egg to the caterpillar or the caterpillar to the chrysalis. You don't have to get them from egg to adult necessarily. So that's just something to remember. You should simply be moving them along in the process. And what I thought when I thought about the chrysalis was your class might actually narrow their perspective. It's possible. Because that's when I saw that, I thought, well, it's got a very more narrow perspective than the caterpillar does. But it could also be introspective or reflective. So I just want to share a great quote from Jack Mazzero about transformative learning. A defining condition of being human is that we have to understand the meaning of our experience. And to me, that smacks of constructivism. If you know anything at all about learning theory, constructivism always talks about making our own meaning of our experiences. So the sounds like constructivism part was me, not the quote. So I'll continue with the quote. For some, any uncritically assimilated explanation by an authority figure will suffice. That part sounds like dogma to me. I really struggle with that. I don't want you to think what I say is right just because I'm the one who said it. I want you to evaluate it with your own experience against your own evidence and build off of that. Continue the quote. But in contemporary societies, we must learn to make our own interpretations rather than act on the purposes, beliefs, judgments, and feelings of others. Facilitating such understandings is the cardinal goal of education. Transformative learning develops autonomous thinking. As a student of the SNU School of Education, we call that a professional decision maker. That's at the top of the framework, the lifelong learner, professional decision maker. So Mazzero goes on to say, we must engage in critical reflection on our experiences, which in turn leads to a perspective transformation. So we're talking about transforming students' perspectives. That's the thing that I struggled with was what's actually happening? What's the thing that happens here? So Mazzero does have several steps, and I know those are really, really tiny letters. But the disorienting dilemma is where this generally starts. And as I mentioned, what I tend to think of that is the cognitive dissonance, the thing that, it's this square peg in the round hole. It just doesn't really fit in with how I've always been seeing the world, or how your students have always been seeing the world. So for me, the challenge in transformative learning, the transformational learning, transformative learning, whatever you want to call it, is how do we put our students in that spot? How do we do that for our students? How do you do that? Does anybody have an example of something that you've been through before, or something that you've seen the student go through one of your classes, where you showed them something that just didn't fit with how they saw the world?
Sustainable living, we talked about consumption, and we are talking about consumption. And the premise of the class is that there's something wrong with the way that we're currently living our lives as the kinds of people who, in terms of how many of us there aren't nearly as many of us North American, middle class North Americans, but we're hogging, X% of the resources depending on the stats. So we talked about the problems with our current food production system. And when we laid all of that out on the board, students were just kind of like, I had no idea the process was that complicated. I had no idea there were so many resources that process sucks.
Right.
And here's the effects of that consumption on our earth. Ooh.
So
and we are responsible for that.
Right.
We are part of the problem.
The decisions that
Our
we make,
choices,
absolutely, the choices that we make. And so using that example, that's the disorienting dilemma. So students have to reflect on what are they doing, what choices are they making that is contributing to that. And then what's the connection between where you want to be and where you currently are now? What are the options that you have? Make a plan of action, and then you just move on through the other steps to where there's a change in behavior. So that's a great example. Good. While I'm not comfortable saying that every single learner goes through every single step in this order, I would be comfortable saying that students generally go through some form of them if you're being purposeful about transformative learning. Mazzero said, and this was something that I really had never thought about, but it really resonates with me. Mazzero says there are 3 types of learning. Transmissional, that's the typical sage on the stage, you're standing up there spewing knowledge, open this up and I'm just gonna put stuff into your brain all day. There's transactional, which transactional is one that I hadn't really thought about. But it's the student has valuable experiences and learns best through experience, inquiry, critical thinking, and interaction with other learners. We're pretty comfortable with that. And then the third one is transformative, and learning can only be considered transformative if it involves a fundamental questioning or reordering of how one thinks or acts. I mean, at SNU, our education should be transformative here simply by the sheer number of theology classes that students take, especially if they come from a life experience where there's been very little emphasis on moral values or theology or anything like that. Anybody have anything to add about that?
I think it's unfair to put that responsibility on theology.
You're right.
But that's really interesting that he separates it, that he has, the 3 differentiations there, because I would agree that we push for transactional more. I mean,
Right.
that's what we're trying, active learning and valuing student and getting them involved. And I wonder if perhaps, although I hear Dennis's voice with the whole having a fundamental question, a problem to solve in your
Mhm.
courses. So I want to be sure to give him credit for that. But I think that we push and we strive to do transactional learning well.
Mhm.
And maybe we aren't differentiating enough between transactional and transformational. I wonder. I don't know.
Yeah, and when we talk about
And I'm
assess,
making a generalization. I'm speaking for everyone here. That's why I said we.
well, and that's what I was
I
gonna
was talking
say.
about the rest of y'all.
In a few minutes, when we talk about assessment, we'll talk about how you have to decide how many of your students, what is your definition of success for students to meet a certain objective? You have to decide that. That's straight from Dennis's mouth. He doesn't have a magic number. He said the number is somewhere between 0% and 100%. And it's not 0 and it's not 100, but it's somewhere in between
Gotta
those
love
two.
Dennis.
So, I mean, that's where you're basically treated as a professional, right? And that you have to make that professional decision. So in the same way, we may have to look at ourselves and say, are we too much transactional and not enough transformative? Are we too much transmissional and not enough transactional? You know, transactional might be an okay place to be depending on your perspective.
Right. I don't know that you can get to transformative straight from transmissional.
I
though.
would totally agree with that.
I think you gotta move into that middle stage, and
And
it's
there
probably.
might be some students who would make those leaps on their own, but it's not something
Uh-huh. I agree.
that the classroom supports, which I think is.
You
what
can
we're
necessarily be
Yeah.
purposeful about
Yeah.
it, right? Right,
And when I look at these, the achiever in me says, oh, I've got to get all of this stuff done.
right.
And I think I'm thinking about one of those, peer learning network sessions, Mary Gentili. Did anybody, she talked about in business ethics, how most of the ethics courses focused on why something was either ethical or
Right.
not ethical.
Right.
And what she thought about doing, this is sort of like this is a generalization, is, okay, let's assume for a moment that you find something that you definitely think is unethical. How do you go about acting because of that? And so when I see these, there's some
Oh, yeah.
there's some exploratory, like why or how or what could we be doing there? And then there's the, okay, I realize we need to change.
Yeah.
How do I change? How then do I live? Kinds of things. So maybe it's
And so that's that last point,
Yeah.
the change in behavior. It's like, maybe I view myself differently, so what do I do about that?
Mhm.
So maybe that's what bumps you up to transformational learning. I don't know.
or maybe because we're not totally responsible for the whole
That's
Crystal's
exactly right.
example,
Right,
maybe some of our courses focus on why or how,
absolutely.
and then others focus on, so you want to make a change, here's how you can do it.
Well, and I talk about that to Jody sometimes, is that I call it closing the circle. And I wonder how often though we close that circle. Like how many of our students are in courses, their senior year in particular, that do that for them. Maybe we push them a lot to ask how and why and who am I? And then sometimes we leave them to flounder and not be.
It's kind of like an essay without a conclusion. You
And
don't,
we want them to
you don't
write their
tie
own
it up.
conclusion,
Right,
but
right.
sometimes I don't know if we give them, I don't know.
Go ahead.
And this is from Dr. Hafler. Often creating new paradigms involves adding a new element to the equation. And T.S. Eliot, an individual talent, is in parentheses. Like buying a new piece of furniture makes you think about possibilities for rearranging the living room. If students are just shuffling their existing mental furniture, there could be a change, but maybe not a transformation.
That's a great analogy.
I was gonna say the
Yeah.
furniture analogy in a house. I'm just thinking,
Yeah.
I've got my science room and I've got my education room. And if I just keep stuffing things in there, then it's a little bit transmissional. But if it's transactional, then okay, maybe I want to take this piece and I might want to put it here. If it's transformative, then okay, I like where this piece is. I like how it fits. Maybe I need to get rid of something else rather than you just keep putting in and putting in. That's a great
Or
analogy.
you open the door in between some of your rooms.
Knock a few walls out.
I like Dr. Hackler's analogy.
I do
That's a
too.
good one.
Going back to the idea of writing their conclusion,
Mhm.
their conclusion may not be written here.
That's
Right.
Their
true.
conclusion may be written out in their job
That's
that
right.
they get,
Mhm.
or
Absolutely.
some experience out in the world that brings it all together finally for them.
Right.
Sure.
Or continued education, or who knows.
You know, I've just, over the past, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, seen so many graduates who have walked away like good students, bright futures, and are successful, but yet couldn't point at something at SNU that transformed them, and I think it's that missed opportunity we have toward the end sometimes, where not to, I say close the circle, but you're right. I mean, they can't do that until they're out of here being, practicing their self-efficacy, if you will. But, yeah, anyway, I think it's that, do we help them move from that vulnerable stage? Are we giving them wing drying time
Mhm.
to then?
Or are we just kicking them out into
Are
the
we
wild?
like
with their
they
wings
busted
still
open
out?
that
Yeah.
chrysalis and
I hear you.
that vulnerable stage? That helps me conceptualize it even better. Our job isn't to necessarily get them into the monarchs that are ready to commute from Canada to Mexico, but kind of help them understand as they're coming out of that shell and give them a little bit of,
At least to go from like Tennessee to Arkansas or something.
if that's where they want to go, then that's fine.
Okay, let's move on. I did, if you're using, by the way, if you're looking at this live online with the presentation, you can click on those steps and there's a little bit more information on each one of those. It'll take you to a website that you can do. So the way in which we reach the destination is the key to transformative learning. It's what sets it apart from the other learning theories. The best part of, well, I didn't give you that quote, but he talks about assimilative. That word assimilative. Oh, yeah, that quote right there. Sorry, I didn't have it in my notes. I should have looked at the slide. I'm going to take a second and read that.
Okay.
So that's another quote from Jack Nazero. And the best part of that quote for me is the assimilative part. We talk a lot in science education, especially in elementary and secondary schools, about assimilation, which is probably why I like that so much. But the other word that I'm reminded of here is acculturate. Is there a time in the past when you've been part of another culture, when you've either short term or long term? Did it influence how you viewed the world? Did you go away from that experience with a different perspective? Anybody care to share a time when you were affected by being a part of some other culture?
Growing up in the military, I grew up on Army bases, and that there were very few times that we lived off a base or post. And so it was very obvious in those times that I was definitely part of a different culture, and that's impacted who I am, even in small ways, that I get really annoyed with people when they're not, being attentive during the national anthem or,
Right.
I mean, even just, so that's like a culture within our culture kind of
It's like a
thing.
subculture, sure.
Mhm.
If any of you have read the Tribal Leadership book where it talks
Yeah.
about like the different stages, I spent a good bit of my life in that whole stage 1, stage 2 thing, and stage 2, stage 3. And so when you come from the culture that says you're focused on surviving, you're focused on like acquiring skills that, while perhaps might not serve you ethically, they will serve you in like it's a means to an end.
Yeah.
That's a huge shift from, because the rest of the world doesn't have to function this way.
Right.
The rest of the world doesn't have to live in a culture that's determined for them. So sort of making that shift into, so these skills might have served me very well here, but now they're really damaging
Right.
and they're not necessary. I think of that, and I also think of Rome. Rome is fantastic for context. I mean, I have never felt so connected to a deeper sense of history. Like a couple hundred
Mhm.
years isn't all that deep. But
Right.
in terms of like,
Yeah, we talked about that.
I mean, that
Yeah.
was
You're
so
driving in a
incredible.
taxi by something that is older than
Our country.
dirt.
Yeah,
I mean, you know.
literally they dug it out of the dirt.
Right.
So you know it's older than
And
that.
you're like in a taxi taking a picture of it with your iPhone.
Yeah.
Going, huh.
Yeah.
You have those, yeah.
So I have another quote to share, and this one's from F. Scott Fitzgerald. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in your mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function.
I always use that in my intro to lit class.
And I always attributed that quote to somebody else.
I'm sorry.
I
Did you
didn't.
attribute it to me?
Maybe, probably not, maybe. So just kind of tying that into transformative learning, that's the idea of cognitive dissonance. You know, give your students the opportunity to explore some different idea, bring in a controversial topic that challenges ideas, long-held truths, and or misconceptions. So this begs the question, where do you start to implement transformative learning in your students' experiences? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to start with the end goal in mind. Where do you want your students to be at the end of the semester? And I think that our administration and people like the Gen Ed director look at things like where do we want students to be at the end of these classes? You know, where are they when they come in, and where do we want them to be at the end of these classes or at the end of this program? So maybe these things are already set out for you. Maybe you already know, you're told the objective of this class is to X, and you as the professional get to design that. So they might be set by the department, Gen Ed Council, some other committee, program committee, like the Teacher Education Committee. I already know in my science in the elementary school class, I already know exactly what the objectives are. I don't have to set that. I don't need that responsibility because we're accredited by so-and-so and they take care of all of that stuff. So you start with the end goal in mind. If your outcomes or objectives are not set for you, however, Gen Ed outcomes are a good starting place. You could either use them to work backwards, so that outcome is the destination, or if you're teaching upper division, then it's an expectation. I expect you already have the ability to do effective communication, and then you build on top of that, or you use that outcome or that expectation rather as you go. So it's a checkpoint along the way. Notice my military terminology, checkpoints and objectives and things like that. I'm getting ahead of myself. So once you know where your students are going, you should be able to create an assessment that's tied to that outcome. So the key to your effective assessment is to tie it to the outcome. It should be measuring that. And I know you guys already know this. However, it doesn't have to be a test per se. I think a lot of times when we talk about assessments, it's like, okay, well, this is going to be 100 questions, multiple choice, 10 of them are going to be true, false, and maybe 1 or 2 will be essay. That's, you know, it's our typical view of an assessment. But maybe it's an artifact. Maybe it's a portfolio of work. Maybe it's in education, one of the things I was just talking to a student this morning, in her freshman year, she's already working on building lesson plans. So she already has these artifacts that she's producing in these other classes. Not only are those artifacts that measure what she does here, but it's going to be useful for her later in life. So it's like, what can you do in your class that students can take this piece that they've created and use it in another class? So what's the problem with it? Well, it's not easy. You've got to be purposeful. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir because we're all overloaded, I'm sure, with we've got to do this, we've got that committee, and you know, there's this to go to and that to go to, and so it's hard. But I think one of the things for me about transformational learning is that nothing is ever done. It's not finished. You know, you don't have. I knew some colleagues when I was teaching in public school who hadn't changed their curriculum in 15 years. You know, maybe even the past has changed in 15 years, The objectives have changed, but their assessments hadn't changed, their lessons hadn't really changed that much. And one of the keys in transformative learning is that maybe that artifact this semester is probably not going to look like the same artifact your students produce next semester. It's one of the things that Dennis and I talked about was like looking back 3 or 4 semesters ago at this big artifact that you have students produce, and you're like, man, what was I thinking with that? That was terrible. But it's these little incremental changes that you do over time. So that's probably why Heather feeds us lunch once a semester and asks us to determine whether or not an assessment actually measures an outcome. Do we need to change the outcome? Do we need to change the assessment? What do we need to do? Do you have anything to add to that, Heather? Did that make you think of anything? No? Okay. All right. Just checking. So you might actually be wondering why I chose my image 2 slides ago. Do you guys remember the image I chose 2 slides ago when I mentioned the military? So what was the outcome of Operation Overlord on June the 6th, 1944? What was the outcome of that?
Sorry, only Heather can answer this question.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Since you wouldn't answer my previous question,
It wasn't a question, you asked if I had anything else. to
You're
add,
right.
I said no.
okay. I'm
So I
sorry.
did
didn't-
answer your
I'm sorry, I did not hear you. I did not hear you say that.
Germans lost, Allies won. Free, liberated France, though Lord knows why.
Is she on Wikipedia?
No.
She Googled Operation
She was
Overlord.
looking down at her computer, I was just checking.
So how,
This is just stuff that sprouts out of my head.
how might one evaluate the success or failure of that operation? I mean, clearly we're saying that we succeeded because of the things that I just mentioned, but how, I mean, what if they had only met 3 or 4 of the objectives? But still we went on and won the war. Would we still consider it successful?
Hopefully, maybe.
That's one thing to think about with your students. Just because every single student doesn't get to the tip top of the rubric doesn't mean that you haven't been successful. Because the key is, where did they start?
Movement.
Right, it's movement. That's exactly right.
Feeling in curriculum in public schools.
Right,
Trying to emphasize movement. Where did I move the kid? From
right,
here to here. I've been successful, even though he's only making a D.
right.
He's not making an F anymore.
Relish in the non-failures rather than the lack of everybody met the objective or everybody only met this condition of the objective or something like that. Okay,
It seems like we're striving against our own psychology at that point.
yes.
I mean, I wonder what that would look like to support institutionally, a shift in perspective.
I just looked at a spreadsheet the other day for a gen ed outcome and it had not met, met at the foundational level, met at the Windows level, ready for graduate school.
That sounds familiar.
Ready for graduate school.
Well, he read one of
Yeah,
one of
that's
Gina's
that's what
gems.
stands
Oh,
out in my
yeah.
head. Was the ready for
But
graduate
what,
school.
what's the 4th one? Exceptional. Exceeds.
Exceeds the
Yeah.
expectation, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you guys. I knew that
I like ready for
Y'all-
graduate school.
Well, that's-
I had
that
to
is-
change that.
y'all would come to my rescue.
One of the
I'll be teaching this class next.
one of the comments
Ready to be the
underneath
TA for this class. There you go.
it. Yes,
I
so
mean,
true.
not every
Wow.
student is going to come out of your class ready to be the TA. So that probably shouldn't be our measure of success or failure.
Well, and it's the same thing that you have with program reviews or with HLC, when we have the HLC visit, it's not that they expect that we're going to meet all of their objectives, but they're looking for, can we articulate what objectives we're meeting and can we articulate what we're going to try in the future to make that progress, to make that,
Right.
that
Movement.
change, that
Yep.
movement.
Mhm. Good.
There's a question from
Okay.
the chat. Since our assessment is linked to courses and majors, how do we assess transformation that crosses these boundaries?
That's a That's a fantastic question. So if I'm understanding the question is how do we assess like the transformational piece of it?
Is that the question?
If that's not what you're asking, let me
She's
know.
typing something.
While she's typing, I'll just
Okay, if a student's lit crit class changes the understanding of theology or their hermeneutic process generally, how do we know?
and I don't know that we do, unless you have some sort of interaction with that student later. It's probably a more of an informal assessment and less formal. So probably that's a question that we need to pose to Dennis is how do we assess the transformative piece of what we're doing as a university? How do we know that we're doing that other than anecdotal evidence or, you know, some sort of interaction with a student?
Well, I think it would be interesting, Gwen asked that question, right?
Mhm.
I think it would be interesting to hear Gwen's perspective, like what her answer is to that question, because, I mean, did you take mythology as an undergrad here? Were you weren't a lit major?
Well, English major, but I didn't.
Okay. She's been teaching a course for years that causes cognitive dissonance. And so how does she see measuring that transformational component? Does she have, what's her perspective on that?
What's your perspective,
question.
Dr. Hack?
What's the perspective on your own question?
Yeah.
She's typing.
Okay.
While she's doing that, I'll just remind us at this point of our mission statement. And our mission is to transform lives through higher education in Christ-centered community. So we have the word transform in our mission statement.
Okay, she says she has them doing final course essays that could elicit some of that, but no way to tell a year later how their thinking is impacted.
Yeah.
So probably at that point, she can see that they're moving from the chrysalis to the adult, emerging adult. But she doesn't know if their wings get dried later necessarily.
Right. But I think that class is a great example of, and I'm not just saying that's the only class that
Everyone
she
be an
teaches.
English major.
No, or the only one on campus, but I wonder how often students encounter those moments and may not be ready for them in that particular class, but then they're in a subsequent class, may or may not be connected at all content-wise, and it's just in there still, in the back of their mind, and then something triggers it, or they finally get to a point where they start to process it. And so it's part of that whole harvesting of the crop. And I do think you said, talking to Dennis about as a university, what do we do to sort of look at them as freshmen and then look at them as seniors holistically?
And I think that's where
I do
my,
not want to be in charge of that project, but I think it would.
I think somebody just volunteered. I think that's where my military analogy breaks down because we have the benefit of history to look back and say, well, it was successful, but we're actually in the trenches. You know, the guys at D-Day who died didn't know that they had a purpose and that they made a difference. So like we're in the trenches hoping that we don't die, you know, trying to make a difference. And so Dr. Hackler points out a good point that we don't really know what kind of a difference we're making all the time.
And that seems to point back to what you're saying about your students that have moved on, Michelle, is that, you know, when they can't sit there and point back at anything at SNU, maybe it's because there's been stuff that's happened in their head in between, that either they don't remember because our own personal memories are fairly short. And I'll speak for myself. My own personal memory is short. The attribution of where those thoughts came from might not be realistic or appropriate. How self-aware are we? And I'm asking just macro questions without any sort of institutional agenda, but
No, I think that's certainly a different way of looking at that issue, though.
Okay, and she brings up that she wishes we could do senior exit interviews like we did years ago with the CCCU project.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I know that there are some departments who do that. And it's actually tied to a portfolio check. So,
I've been thinking about that brick wall.
Mhm.
You know, I'm not sure what the intent was on that, but I look at it as you're one brick in that wall, and so if you're not in that wall, then the wall's not gonna be stable and secure for
Right.
that student. And
Right.
whether you're at the beginning or the end, wherever you are in that process. And it reminds me of one of my bosses years ago, it said, when someone leaves a facility, that it's like putting your hand in a bucket of water. When you pull your hand out of the bucket, you can't tell that your hand was there.
mhm.
And that just really disturbed me, because I thought, did that mean you think that I or anyone else would not make a difference
Mhm.
when they were gone, you know? So,
Yeah, that's a different way of looking at that hand in the water. If you take a brick out, you're gonna notice that brick is gone.
And that's one of the things I noticed when I was looking for an image to create that. I wanted an image of the brick wall that I could put text on. And one of the pictures that I saw was a brick wall that had about 15 bricks and a big hole. And those bricks had fallen out. So one brick had fallen, another brick had fallen, another brick had fallen. And so that's an internet meme, the keep calm thing
Mhm.
that's been
It's
revived
not a-
from
Yeah, okay, go ahead, yeah. I was gonna wait and see if Heather was gonna jump in.
anyway.
You gonna sing it, or?
No, I just wanted you to tell him it didn't originate on the internet.
Oh.
I said they revived it from World War II, right?
You were
Okay.
getting there.
Okay, I was working on it. I don't want to demean what your purpose is at this university at all. And I don't think transformative learning does that. It's just a good reminder that we're not responsible for the big picture. We're responsible for our one objective. I had even gone and done a little bit of research on the Normandy invasion, talking about Maxwell Taylor and James Gavin. They were the 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne commanders. And like they were only focused on their objective. They were not looking at the bigger picture. They just knew that they had to meet their objective so that someone else could do their thing and someone else could do their thing and so on.
To be honest, the first thing I thought was Pink Floyd, and I was like, oh, that's so depressing.
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh,
Absolutely.
so depressing.
If you type in brick wall and search, that's like the top results. So I did not watch that video though. Okay, so we've talked about that. The one thing I do want to point out here is you need to know where your students start though. If you're going to see where they've moved from, you need to know where they started. So post or pre-test are a key component here, which raises all kinds of questions. Well, if they can do the pre-test, then do they really need to be taking the class? And that's not a question for me to answer. But it did enter the discussion when Dennis and I talked about this. So just know that that is recognized. Okay, the other part of this is to give the process time to work. I've even seen this in churches. Okay, we're going to do this new thing, and 2 months later, well, that's not working, so let's try something else. Maybe you just need to tweak what you're doing. Or maybe you just need to keep doing it and see if it works after a while. I mean, 10 years later, if it's not working, you should do something different. But as teachers, we need to do some reflection, though. It is a key component of this. It's a two-way street on the reflexive part of transformational learning, is we need to reflect on our practice. Scaffolding, Tamara mentioned scaffolding. Remember that students can't handle the entire elephant. They only need to be fed one bite at a time. And to use another analogy, think of your outcome, the outcome of your department as a table. And the objectives that you're teaching are the legs of that table. Unpack the outcome into its component pieces and develop objectives that work toward the outcome. So back to that D-Day invasion piece. And the last analogy I'll use here, you can see it on the screen there, is a bit like seeing a picture of all the pieces of a car and thinking there's no way this is ever going to be a working car. But once you put all of them together and each piece does its function, then you have a very complicated system, sometimes convoluted, but complicated system that accomplishes a purpose. And it accomplishes a bigger purpose than any one single part could do. So I do need to make a disclaimer on this slide. This is right, we're right here at the end, by the way, for those of you that need to be done. I didn't come up with any of these ideas that we're these two ideas. I did not invent Google Docs at all. And I did not invent, I know you guys
I
are
can tell
surprised.
everybody.
Yeah, I know. And I did not invent the go bag that I'll talk about in a second. I did have a student though, and I've probably mentioned this before when I've talked about Google Docs. I had a student who experienced her own transformation when using Google Docs. She was exposed to it in my class. And I gave them relevancy. I talked to them about why it's a great tool and all of that. And she literally came to me later and said, Google Docs changed my life. She started using it in other classes. She started exposing other students to it. It made collaboration easier, et cetera, et cetera. You guys have heard the Google Docs sermon before. But she had that transformational experience, and I think that's a good example. The other one that I'll mention is, again, not one that I created, but one that Dennis did. I've looked at Earth's natural disasters after studying this because I redesigned the course. I tweaked it. I didn't really redesign it. But Dennis had designed the course, and I can see how he's using these components of transformational learning. One of the things is the go bag. At the end of the course, the students are required to put together a go bag. Or actually, I made it an optional assignment, but I may go back and redo that now. Put together a go bag and tell why do you have each piece in there. And so in that way, they're actually preparing, they're recognizing that they're susceptible to natural disaster. So that's a change in their thinking probably. And they're changing their behavior in that now they are actually prepared to do something about it. Do you have any examples of something like this, like an artifact type piece that you've experienced? I know Katie talked about the sustainable living idea and how students' thinking has changed. Any other examples that you've thought of? Okay.
I don't think I've assessed this well,
Okay.
but we're taking an entire meal from farm to table,
Uh-huh.
meat included. So that involves the students knowing why we are not selecting certain things. That involves the students understanding what parameters are necessary. That involves the students actually growing some of their own food. That involves the students participating and understanding, okay, how does gardening fit into the bigger picture of what does it mean to live sustainably?
Mm-hmm.
That involves, like, this Saturday we're going to the farmer's market and we're gonna buy stuff for our meal that we haven't grown ourselves.
Right.
And we had some students butcher chickens. Took a chicken from a live squawking animal to a roaster in a bag.
There you go.
And so, I mean, that.
Yeah. And that's, you know.
That was optional.
Sure.
I didn't want anybody to sort of be traumatized.
Right.
So,
Well, and I think the
Chickens
thing,
were actually
The chickens were
killed.
Chickens
in
were
the
actually
making.
harmed.
harmed in the
Yeah.
making of this.
there actually were chickens harmed in the making of this
yeah,
class.
yeah.
I think the key though that you said was the very first thing you said, I don't know that I've assessed this well.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily, and that's a key component of this because it doesn't mean that you just throw it away and go, well, I need to start over. You just keep working and
Like, I don't
building.
have a rubric for my meal. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Right.
Like you either eat something edible and it either is or it's not, but I don't know that I don't have a thing to sit down
Right.
and grade and say,
And
the
you're
lettuce was from the garden, the green onions were, or, you know, I don't know.
well, I mean, and I could see how a rubric for that could be made. Like the student was able to express or describe the process by which the lettuce came to the table.
Mhm.
You know, they met that piece of the objective. So that's a fantastic example. thank you guys. That's all that I have. I hope that this continues a conversation. And I appreciate you guys coming and sharing your examples and adding to the discussion.
Are you gonna draw for that?
Yes, I am going to draw for the gift card.
I think a course like the aesthetics that I teach freshmen,
Uh-huh.
it's like a beginning to all of this.
It is.
Yes.
It's getting them to look at things they're not used to looking at,
Yes.
in a way they're not used to looking at it,
Right.
and then making decisions. Because I tell them all along, there's no right or wrong in this class in anything we
Why
do.
don't you just do the top?
It's all
box? Does that
opinion,
not
and
work?
the idea is to support
At
their
the very
opinion.
top?
And
Yeah.
Oh, I
that's what
see,
we're
yeah.
doing constantly.
Yeah.
We're looking at art. And what about it? What
Yeah.
do you like? What do you like? What techniques did they use?
How many do we
did they
have on
use
there?
them? How effective is it?
Mhm.
And we don't talk about evaluation in terms of I like it or I don't like it. We talk it in terms of artistic merit. Does it meet certain
Yeah, Heather.
artistic ideas?
Go back to that front page.
So-
$10 Amazon gift card.
Woohoo.
Congratulations, Heather.
Thank you.
Hopefully they can use that and transfer it to other things.
Right.
In other
To
courses.
where?
Yeah, and,
The very
and
front
we heard
page.
that from them, I've heard that
Of
from them a
this?
lot with
No.
Melissa's course. That in many ways, that
Up the
course
top.
is harder for
There.
them
Yeah.
than many
Oh,
other
it's
foundation
rigid.
courses, because it's not something that most of them have ever had any experience
Mhm.
with.
And I hear things that make me think it's being successful at least some extent when they
Yeah.
say.
Thank y'all for
"I don't
joining
really
us.
listen to classical music. but I
Appreciate you
found that,
guys.
you know, it
Hey,
does
Lisa,
this
I
and
see that
this,
you're
you
there.
know, and that I really have heard it more than I thought I had
Did she join mine?
in other forms and stuff. And so you hear things. like
Thank
that
you.
from them.
Appreciate you guys being a part.
But that's kind of how I see the whole course.